Hello, everyone. You are listening to podcast episode of Studio Forum on Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Olivera Simic. I'm associate professor with Griffith University in Queensland, Australia. My guest today is Heleen Touquet. She is a voluntary fellow with KU Leuven and also visiting professor at University of Antwerp. I know Heleen through our work on sexual violence in war, but there is some difference between our work and our focus, and I've been always interested in her work because I think it's very original, and Heleen is one of the first people to look at conflict-related sexual violence of men. So I would like to start by asking Heleen why you focused on male experiences of conflict-related sexual violence, because it's quite common to focus on female experiences of sexual violence, but not of males. And this topic hasn't been really explored. It's still, if I may say, under-researched. But 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it has been completely taboo, kind of. So if you can just tell us why this topic.
Why? Yeah, I think initially when I started doing research on Bosnia, I was mostly working on the current political situation. I mean, this was back in 2006, between 2006 and 2010. I wasn't really looking into details of the war or anything, but I think I started to know the people more, and I was really getting interested in testimonies of the war and started to read up on that. And I was reading the report by the Bassiuni Commission on war crimes. So Bassiuni basically sent a human rights team to document human rights violations during the war. And this report contained a lot of testimony of male victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And I was very surprised by that because I had never heard of that. So it sort of started to interest me, like, why is there such a silence about this? And I was actually sharing the office with a colleague of mine, Koen Slootmakers, who was working on LGBT rights. And so we were sort of speculating how is this sort of connected also to homophobia? And, we started to talk about that, and I started getting more and more interested and reading more and more, and then managed to meet a couple of people who were working on male victims in Uganda. And I started researchers and started talking to them, and then finally decided to apply for research funding, which I got from KU Leuven. Got research funding for 2 years, and then I started to cooperate with local psychiatrists and did interviews with male survivors. I started finding more information and more testimony, and then I'm currently trying to write a book about it to summarize my findings.
So maybe just to go back to that silence, can you tell us a little bit why there was a silence? What are the main reasons that this topic is still kind of taboo and not that, I can't say, maybe it's now of course better explored than it was, but there is still a lot of stigma and taboo around this topic and not much in the public. We don't see male survivors much talking about this in the public.
And I actually found one Swiss journalist, a Swiss woman, who wrote about sexual violence against men. I think this was 1995, and she put it on the front of the newspaper. It was called Le Quotidien. And she was convinced that this was going to be some kind of breakthrough, and now everyone was going to pay attention to male victims. And she said it just went dead. And it was on the front page, and then nothing happened. And she said all my male colleagues in the office, all the other journalists were very, very embarrassed about this, and no one really dared to talk about it. So, and I think this is a pattern that you see also in the local newspapers, that people will write about, this is the last taboo. Then the title is The Last Taboo. A male victim speaks, and then they have this short interview with someone who survived it, and that's it. And there's not really an analysis of why does this happen and what is the connection between this happening during the war and sexual violence against men, for example, in peacetime in prisons, because there are obviously connections, but it's something that is unspeakable, and I think it has to do with the way we imagine the nation and the way we imagine men as protectors of the nation and protectors of women and girls, and therefore when we think of men as vulnerable beings, it sort of tarnishes our image of the nation.
So that's maybe difference between women victims and male victims, and not just about also this collective identity, how women who were not sexually abused see women victims. There is some empathy, there is encouragement, there is a reach out. There are a lot of women, for example, NGOs who are trying to help and assist women who were victims, and a lot of other women trying to help. But that is not the case with the males. There is no really associations who are dedicated just to male victims of conflict with sexual violence. As, for example, in Bosnia, we have dozens of NGOs, women NGOs, who are just working with women survivors of sexual violence, and they are very prominent also in the public. But that's not the case with the males.
No, not at all. But also because many men don't want to speak about this, they don't want to share this, or it's difficult for them to find help. Many are veterans, so they would be in veterans organizations, for example. But this would, of course, not be something that they would speak about. But they would be sort of members of other types of organizations. And some men actually do go to these women organizations. Some of them are members, and this is actually how it became more publicly known, because some men became members of Bakira Hashecic's organization, Women Victims of War, when the Bosnian government decided to give some sort of compensation for victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And it was not, they didn't make a distinction between women or men, they could both apply. And then many men started to reach out to these organizations who could help them get that compensation.
Who is the main support for male victims of sexual violence? What about their families? From your experience, from your research, like, do they have support from their families, or do they also hide from their families? What happened to them?
Well, some do have supportive families. Of course, I spoke to male victims who were doing therapy with a psychiatrist. So there's a certain bias there. So I only spoke to the ones that got help. I don't know if I can generalize from that, but definitely, yes, some had supportive families, but there were also other cases where, for example, this one man from Kosovo who had told his wife after they got married that this happened to him, and she decided to divorce. So this also happens, and there's families also where everyone knows, but they don't really dare to speak about it. So it causes a lot of tension among families, definitely. Yeah.
Is there a kind of some uniqueness in terms of experiences of male victims in the Balkan region? Because you've done a lot of research and read about other cases in regions in the world. This is quite common for all males victims of sexual violence, that there is a stigma, that there is a taboo, that there is a fear from the community to find out about these experiences, or is something very unique to the Balkans?
It's not at all unique to the Balkans. It's very common that there's a stigma on sexual violence in general, and certainly for men. And it's given the fact that patriarchy is pretty universal. There is also a universal stigma for sexual violence victims. Yeah.
So you mentioned that report that you've done, analysis on the Kosovo. Can you tell us a little bit more? That was recently published.
Yes, we published that in December, I think, together with Henry Mirtanen, and we worked together with the Kosovo Center for Torture Victims in Pristina. They work with torture and sexual violence victims, and they also have a lot of male clients. And so we worked together with them to think of questions and do interviews, and they did 13 interviews with men and a couple of family members. They also interviewed brothers and a father in order to also get the perspective of a family member. That's what we put in the report, basically. But I think the difference between Kosovo and Bosnia is that there was no Basiuni Commission in Kosovo, so there is a lot less evidence from the period of the war. So a lot of the urgency, I think, also of male victims to speak about it is because they feel the need to have their story heard and to put it in paper and to have like an actual piece of evidence of what happened to them.
So did you spoke with the family members as well?
Yeah, we had 3 or 4, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
So would that be exception, the case that you mentioned where a wife left her husband after she found out about that? Would that be exception, or is that the only case?
That's really hard to tell because we only interviewed, 14 people. So I don't know if you can generalize from there. But there were definitely some cases. And I know that from my colleagues who worked in Uganda, that there were also wives in Uganda who said, you are not a man anymore, so I'm leaving you. Yeah.
So how they experienced or have they went through any transitional justice processes in terms of criminal proceedings or reparation, or that we talked about?
Well, there is Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. All the three of them have compensation or reparations for victims of sexual violence. It's very different, though, how it is administered and who can get it. In Bosnia, it's part of social benefits. For example, when you're a soldier, a former soldier or former combatant in Bosnia, you cannot access it. And it's only in the federation. You know that. It's not in the Republika Srpska. Whereas in Croatia, it's administered through the Ministry of Veterans Affairs, which means that actually veterans have sort of privileged access to it because they're well connected to this ministry, of course. So you see that it sort of also has a certain political function. And then in Kosovo, I think the process is still ongoing. There are a lot less men than women who apply across the board in Croatia, Kosovo, and Bosnia. And you see that these processes are also stalling a little bit. There's fewer and fewer survivors who want to apply for these reparations. And then also the problem is, of course, they have to go to a commission. They have to talk about, what happened to them. So they have to sort of go through all of that again. So it really relies on the victims to come forward. And I think that's one of the problems with that. And in terms of retributive justice, there are trials where people speak about sexual violence against men, but it's only seldom that people actually get convicted for that.
So maybe just to tell us a little bit about methodology or challenges, like in terms of reaching out to these victims, how difficult is it to get access to your subjects or interviewees? Is it more difficult than, I would assume, to get access to women victims of sexual violence? How to go about that?
Well, of course, and I think there's a lot of ethical issues with that. You can't just call up anybody and just say, I'm going to interview about what happened to you or something like that. So you need to really be very careful and protective. And I decided to work with psychiatrists and I met Mladen Lončar, who was a Croatian psychiatrist who himself had been a witness of sexual violence against men in a camp, and after he got out of there, he decided that his life's mission was going to be to work on sexual violence against men. And I talked to him and he wanted to cooperate. So we decided together to interview male victims. And I think that was really a great way to do it because people could speak to him. I was there, but they had a trust relationship with him. He would select people, so he wouldn't take people that would be easily re-traumatized. So he could judge, whether they were ready to do that. And then we sort of did those interviews together. And then in Sarajevo with Fehma Kovac, Fehma had done a PhD on male victims, a PhD in psychiatry, and she did a couple of interviews for me because we wanted to protect the people. Because many of them, nobody knows, that this happened to them. They want the story to get out, but they also don't want to be known. So all of these interviews were anonymized thoroughly. And Fehma did them for me. And then in Kosovo, we worked with KRCT. Yeah.
So why is it important to document these stories?
Why is it important to document anything? I think it's just a fact of war that we often forget, and I think it's important because it tells you so much about gender and conflict and gender and war and how that functions, and the silence about it tells you so much about war and about conflict and gender.
Do you feel that there has been some shift in these conversations, or there hasn't been much change because you have been a long time in these issues, last 15 years? Has there been any shift in terms of removing some stigma or taboo about male sexual
No,
violence?
I think there's actually very, very little work on stigma. The stigma is not even discussed. The conversations are usually about there is a silence and the silence must be broken, but the way people think we break the silence is by telling victims to tell their stories. And the question is whether that's actually really necessary, or should we maybe think about the stigma before we let them tell their stories? Because, there's, for instance, these small documentaries that these war survivor NGOs make that as well, and then they have these men talking, and then it gives them sort of sense that they will be able to tell their story and testify about it, but then it gets embedded in this sort of nationalistic documentary narrative. And I know some people who participated in one of these documentaries, and afterwards they were stigmatized by people who had seen them in there, and they went into hiding actually after that, or they didn't want to speak to anybody anymore after that happened. So it's really a risk to speak about this. So I don't think like asking survivors to break the silence because we feel that is needed to break the stigma is not a good idea.
So the projects that have been run to support male victims of sexual violence, have these projects have been mainly done by NGOs?
No projects have been run to help male survivors, not at all. There's nothing.
There is nothing for them, either
No.
by NGOs or by the government. There is only
No.
psychological, psychiatrist help and therapies.
If you're lucky that you can find a psychiatrist that knows something about this and that wants to work with you, but there's not that many. There are not many psychiatrists in Bosnia or in any of the other countries, and people who actually also know about this and know how to deal with this and know how to do talk therapy or other forms of therapy, there's not that many.
That seems very hard to research on. Like, it's one of these topics that are really hard. Like, we would think that sexual violence in war, reaching out, or, as I said, finding female victims of sexual violence is much easier. But it seems, from what I'm hearing, it's just seems really difficult to get access and get also story out. So this report that you've done, and you said that you are working on the book. Can you tell us a little bit about what's the book about and what's the kind of aim of your book? What would you like people to learn or change, or what would be the main outcome of speaking about these issues?
Well, I don't know if I'm aiming for big changes because I haven't seen them in the past 15 years, so I don't think my book is going to make much of a difference. Although I do think that on an international level, and the fact that we are, talking about this right now means that, there's some kind of openness that maybe wasn't there 25 years ago. But I do have the feeling that it's a recurring phenomenon where we open the taboo, we speak about it, and then it gets closed again. And I think the aim of the book is really to speak about that, about how it is opened up, and then we look, and then we close it back again. And what I want to explore in the book is how that functions to support patriarchy, basically, or gender hierarchies.
Is there a way for that to stay open up? What would be the ways to keep that topic open up rather than keep closing and opening? Is there, what needs to change for this?
Everything needs to change, Olivera.
Tell me a few things that need to change.
Well, you need to rethink the gender binary, masculinity, femininity, and why we attach value to things that are masculine because they're inviolable and invulnerable, and why feminine things are the opposite, and how we attach value to these things. And if we can change that, then we can change the world.
Fantastic. And just the last question, how do you deal with these difficult topics? How do you find a way to, or like how this impacts you doing?
Well, that's why it took me so many years, because I take breaks.
Okay, that's would be one advice, to take breaks in between.
Just don't do it.
Or if you do it, take long breaks
take
or
breaks.
Short breaks.
Yeah, just don't do this continuously because it will wreck you. Yeah, you have to take breaks and do other things. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen.
You're welcome.